thinking about things like social media, for example, or that free app you just downloaded. There's often an exchange of value, and quite often your data is what you're offering up. But at the end of the day, very frequently people are the weakest link. The trust that people put into your business, if that's fractured, it's really difficult to come back from. There's nothing worse than not being prepared, because then it is a case of what do we do? And it's probably the worst place a business can find itself. Ultimately, the big takeaway, no matter what level of business, is acknowledging the risk. I mean, that's the very first step.
So welcome, James, to the Motoring Chronicles. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me.
Okay, so, look, you do deal with cybersecurity and all that means, but you also are in the technology space in other ways. Can you just explain what your companies do?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the CEO and Managing Director of Wyze Business Advisory and Cyber Wyze. One's more concentrated on digital transformation and strategic enablement of businesses commercially, and the other one's got a really keen focus on cybersecurity initiatives.
Okay. Well, on that cybersecurity side of things then. Okay. For us idiots, cybersecurity, what is it? And what does it mean to be hacked or breached?
Yeah, cybersecurity is such a rich, complex topic, but it really relates, to IT systems and data and the security of it. When we think cyber, we're not thinking about some sort of, foreign technological piece. Cybersecurity is really about just considering all the different elements of our digital life, the information that's stored in systems and, the security of that information. When we think about a breach, in the same light, it's not just a case of someone breaking down your front door, but in a digital sense, there's lots of ways that, cyber compromises happen, and a hack is just one of them. There can be data breaches by virtue of poor policies and practice. People leave, unencrypted USBs in an airport terminal, for example. Right. People sending corporate information over personal email. There's lots of different, ways that these things can sort of come unstuck. But a hack or / breach is probably the better way to look at it, and thinking about, what are the cybersecurity safeguards that can be put in place around it.
So, I mean, traditionally, I'm guessing most of us would think your computer's been hacked or breached. But actually, in the world we live in now, we're talking anything that's connected to the internet. So, and goodness me, that's a lot of stuff, right? We're talking smartphones, computers, obviously, laptops, televisions even, and for us on this show, cars as well, right? So even modern cars are connected cars. So it's pretty much anything these days.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think there's too many devices, systems, or offerings out there that don't have some sort of connected feature or option. Often these things are designed to create convenience in our lives, but there's often a cost, and whether that cost, is a material one or not, often that's in the purchase price, but the potential cost in investing in a product or service and having it compromised is something everyone should really consider. And with everything sort of, plugged in these days, I think, people often don't take the time to, actively consider what it is they're about to do, whether that's enroll in a free app, and consider, why is it free?
Yes.
What am I giving over in this transaction? Because, often there's an exchange of value, right? You get something for free. What do they get? Yes. And often it's your data, and, thinking about things like social media, for example, or that free app you just downloaded. There's often an exchange of value, and quite often your data is what you're offering up. And people need to be quite, considerate of that.
Okay, so James, there's been some pretty amazing examples of massive businesses being hacked in the last few months, last year or so. So how does such a thing happen? So I mean, cybersecurity must be high on the agenda of companies that have tens of thousands, millions even of customers and their data, personal data, financial data even within their system. So how can such a thing happen?
Yeah, look, I mean, without commenting on the individual cases themselves, I think, broadly, when we think about these large businesses that have got our data, one of the things that is very commonplace is that they'll have, robust cybersecurity practices, policies, and teams. And I think what it really highlights to everybody is that, even though small businesses are just as susceptible to a breach or a hacking attempt, the value and the maturity of the attackers that go after these, large organizations, it's big business, right? So you've got these large organizations which are holding millions of, gigabytes worth of people's data. The data that's really highly valuable or sensitive data, very, very personal information. And it creates a great target. And there's only so many holes that can be addressed in a cybersecurity practice. Most organizations take on a most restrictive approach to technology, systems configuration, and security credentialing. But at the end of the day, very frequently people are the weakest link in the chain, and you can have, really robust systems in place, and you might have great policies, but if those policies aren't in practice or people make mistakes, which they do, then it can lead to really some adverse circumstances. So depending on the type of breach, sometimes it comes from the people. And that's not to say that, systems don't obviously share part of that piece, but you're only as strong as your weakest link. And, frequently people are a big part of the contribution to these breaches, whether that's, phishing, whether or not, they've had their credentials scraped, whether they've used public networks, whatever the vector of attack might have been, there's, frequently a human element to it. Now, obviously, the way that organisations configure their systems heavily plays into how rich of a target that they are. But if the motivation's there, like, any organised crime group, if the goal is worth the effort and the potential risk, then they'll continue to make those sorts of attacks on an ongoing basis. And they're often sitting in foreign jurisdictions, which make it really difficult as well for us to take action. They're generally not homegrown. Most attacks are usually foreign based, but certainly it can come from anywhere. But
So we've probably everybody has had those strange emails with odd hyperlinks, and maybe they come from an odd source. If you look at where the email has come from, and maybe people have had those messages on the old SMSs and stuff, and we are saying, aren't we, that it could be as simple as someone just hitting a hyperlink, and that could give access to a multi-billion-dollar company's system.
Sure.
If that one person accidentally does that.
It could happen. I'd like to think that a large organisation has a number of controls in place so that it's not one mistake that could lead to any one particular issue. And often that's the case, right, is that it's not necessarily one thing. It's a systematic failure of a number of things which in combination create for a breach.
Yeah.
But you mentioned, we think about emails coming through, right? We're presented with emails. Some of them stand out quite apparent that they're from something that doesn't quite seem right, or the grasp of your language you're expecting the email in isn't quite right, or whatever it might be. But quite often, one of the greatest vectors of attack is that they'll get into an organisation, they'll understand the nuance of communication, they'll understand what's a normal type of email to send and the regularity of emails and the types of frequency of requests that come through. And they'll often, create a point in time where they're going to go and impersonate a particular account of authority to make a request which to the end user wouldn't be abnormal, and there might be just a couple of changes, but yeah, it often leads to a pretty bad outcome. But yeah, look, I mean, training, we sort of going back to the core, right? Training, awareness, education, they're all part of the big pillars of cyber defense on top of systems, right?
Yeah.
So it all plays together.
Okay, so my example there that a big company might be in peril from a simple email and a click on a hyperlink, that might not happen because they've got multiple barriers between that happening and access to all the data. But on a smaller scale, if we're talking small business, medium-sized business even, then the potential is there.
I think the likelihood is probably there in a smaller business. They generally have less sophisticated controls, practices, policies. You might have sole directors or small business owners, which are also admins, and so, look, a mistake could lead to, significant repercussions for a small business if they don't have some of those controls.
So, well, on that note then, let's just say you're a small business, you have customers, you take the financial information from those customers, you have them on a list somewhere that, they're your customers, they might be regulars, whatever it is, you've got their data somewhere. What are there legal responsibilities from big business and corporations through to this small business with just a few hundred or a few thousand customers? What are the legal ramifications for you if it all goes horribly wrong?
Yeah, and it varies, right? So every business is operating in different regulatory frameworks. There are some things that may be an issue to one business that aren't to another. But I think at the core of it all is that, people don't often know what their responsibilities are. And that's why I sort of regularly caution business owners to get educated on what their responsibilities are. And that can be even not little things, but, often overlooked things such as the Corporations Act. There are things implicit in the Corporations Act for directors and officers that have direct implications to risk, and cyber being one of those risks. So that often affects many businesses depending on their legal entity or configuration. But depending on business size or parameters, there's notifiable data breach requirements under law. There's Privacy Act constraints that people need to consider as well, personally identifiable information. And I think that this is kind of the heart of this, right, is that a lot of businesses are transacting in data day to day, and it all seems normal, right? BAU. A lot of businesses are just transacting and pushing information around, and but it's really incumbent upon everybody to understand, what data they have, where they store it, if they need it after they use it, and do they dispose of it? Do they back it up? And what happens if it all goes wrong? And even if we sort of just put a pin in it for a second and we said that put the legals aside, the trust that people put into your business, if that's fractured, it's really difficult to come back from. And, those that do have a best chance of, continuing business, least scathed, are often the ones that, irrespective of the breach, they've got demonstrated practices of approach. They've got maturity in their cyber capabilities in their business, and they can demonstrate to their customers that they take their data seriously and that they had reasonable and appropriate controls in place. And despite their best efforts, there's a bad outcome. That goes a much better way to preserving customer relationships than having it all go wrong and not being prepared for it.
So that's really key, right? I mean, this idea of the trust that a business has with its customers is absolutely vital, right, for small and medium-sized businesses especially.
Yeah, and I mean, no one's immune. And, if I think about automotive examples I've seen where, there's practices that wouldn't align with any best practice anywhere. And, I think, about personal experience myself and one for
Sure.
a business partner, all too recently where, you think about you go on a test drive, a mobile device comes out, they take a photograph of your ID, potentially could be using some application. Most people don't really necessarily think about the implications of that. And, it's not always visible how a business manages that data as well. And,
Yeah.
Sometimes I probably draw a question mark as to whether or not it's being managed at all. But I've also seen circumstances, myself personally recently, where a main dealer sent a contract of purchase in a Word document for someone to put credit card details in to arrange deposit. And, look, it's not unusual, right, that we see, legacy systems continue to move on. And I think it's a great reminder that businesses, big or small, need to think on their practices, and that, while it might have been insecure then, a long time ago, but it might have been a common practice for people to do such things and send documents of that nature. It's really out of step with, what industry expects, but also what consumers would expect in terms of the way you manage their data.
Yeah, and as a consumer, I know there are rules in place for us to ask businesses, corporations, what's being done with our data. Does that flow down to a business of any size? I mean, if I was to go to a small local business that I know has kept certain financial information about me, or has my personal data, could I go in and ask, and should I go in and ask, you've got this, how are you looking after it? What barriers have you got in place to make sure it's secure? Is that reasonable?
I think it's a perfectly reasonable expectation. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us as consumers and business owners to think about actively who's got our data and why. If we get our vehicle service and they take, a number of our records, we should be, concerned, not necessarily that they're mishandling it, but concerned with how they are handling it and what their privacy policy is, how they manage the data, how they protect it, what they do with it. When they're maintaining that data, do they maintain it? Do they back it up? Where is it stored? I mean, they're things that we should all be cognizant of, and they're really important. Because frequently, a lot of these breaches and identity theft, just an example of, they use everyday businesses to access that information, because it's all about where it's stored. And if it's stored in an insecure manner, or in a system where people think, oh no, that won't be us, they make it a ripe target, particularly for that.
So, if I were a small business owner, I should be expecting, or at least if I don't expect to have that question every day, at least I should have an answer for that question should someone come up to me and ask it.
Yeah, look, I think, we personally, certainly at Cyber Wyze, get brought in frequently to assist businesses navigating vendor supply. Customers, small and big now, are requiring quite extensive due diligence around data and systems. And businesses need to be able to respond. They need to demonstrate that they've got the right policies in place, they've got the right mechanisms and controls in place, that they engage in healthy cybersecurity practices, they align with industry standard frameworks, and that they're maintained. And it's no longer becoming an obscure expectation. It's becoming a really commonplace expectation, and the standards being brought down on a lot of organisations. So I think, we're seeing it further uptown for sure. But I think every small business owner, and Australia is built on small business, should be concerned and taking the opportunity to be proactive. I think it creates a great competitive advantage for you to be proactive
Yeah.
and build some maturity that's appropriate for your business. You don't necessarily need to hit an upper echelon of cybersecurity. While that could be great, it may not be reasonable depending on the size and parameters of your business. So cybersecurity is about right sizing the approach, because you still need to conduct business without the heavy burden of an overly cautious approach. Just like any governance, risk or compliance endeavor, there's always a balance there, right? But but it should be on everyone's radar, and they should be taken seriously.
I was going to say, if you're the owner of a independent workshop or a used car dealership or whatever, it's your expertise is going to be in cars, not computers necessarily. So while you might be conscious that cybersecurity and data, when you keep it and everything is important, I guess, you should, I guess, approach a company like yours, or to say, how do I do this? Because they're not going to know, are they?
Oh, look, I think that's always the case, right? We always seek external expertise when it's a bit of a knowledge gap. I think that for many businesses, you've got to start asking the question. That's probably really where it starts. And whether you engage someone to assist or not, I think you've got to educate yourself on, what's required of you, what the expectation is, of customers, but also regulatory expectations as well, and take steps to resolve them.
So James, we've touched on a bit of this already, but what are the sort of practical steps that a business can take to protect themselves and protect their customers' data? What are the logical steps for them to take?
Yeah, look, I think probably the first thing to recognise is that there's no one size fits all, right? That cybersecurity is a journey. But I think ultimately the big takeaway, no matter what level of business, is acknowledging the risk. That's the very first step. Organisations, big and small, need to really understand the risk. And then what they need to do is really ultimately look at all the different elements of their business, their data, their information systems, who they transact with, their industry regulation requirements, and come up with an approach which makes practical sense. It's not about just implementing systems and controls for the sake of it, but there are reasonable controls that a business should look at. But the depth and breadth of those will vary depending on the size of the business. But simple ones like, business continuity plans, disaster recovery around their business, how do they maintain trust, through an incident response plan, what sort of policies and procedures are in place. Like, they're very simple, not necessarily easy, but simple things that businesses can do to address risk, or especially around cyber. And then moreover, taking proactive measures. And, what those measures will be determined on a business by business basis, because everyone's different, right? Everyone's running a different show, but there's some fundamentals, big ones I always talk about to organisational leaders, which seems, almost a give in, right? But you'd be surprised just how many organisations haven't quite adopted it yet. But, things like multi-factor authentication, strong password policies, and that's not just documents, that's IT-driven policies around how often passwords are changed, potentially adopting things like password managers, which create passwords on your behalf, long, hard to remember passwords, because as we know, a lot of breaches come about because people recycle passwords. So they're obviously a big area as well. Proactively patching and updating systems, software. Staying up to date and, maintaining vigilance. You should be alert, not alarmed. And it's a case of keeping your eyes out and understanding what's happening, keeping abreast of, information changes or system changes as they come about. You need to be engaged. And that's a lesson for all businesses at every level, is that cyber should now fall into, every other part of your governance, risk and compliance management process. And it should be on your risk register.
So a lot of what you said there seems, I'm guessing, could be picked up by individuals as well, right? Just Joe Public.
Yeah.
And two-factor authentication, that's something that I've heard of in the sort of general conversations about cybersecurity. So a lot of what you just said is applicable to the Joe Public.
Yeah, look, I mean, I always tout that the best way to get people adopting best practice is ultimately educating them on how they can implement it in their home life. Because if people use those same skills, tactics, techniques in their home life to preserve their own data, use password managers, multi-factor authentication, these are quite simple approaches, then, it really helps people carry that into the workplace. So we'll frequently deliver training which has a bit of a personal flavour to it, because if we can give people, that sense of how to conduct themselves securely online, they'll take those same skills into the workplace, which is ultimately where we want to see it in practice.
And so, go back to the business side of things. If a business finds that they have been hacked, what on earth do they do? What on earth do you do?
Yeah.
What are the steps you can take?
Well, it's the scary prospect, right? I mean, the first thing I think to acknowledge is that, for many breaches, organisations don't even know they're breached. There'll be many organisations today that are breached and have no idea.
Right.
The point is that, when it gets to the point where you discover a breach, you don't want to be thinking about what you're going to do. And that's why I sort of lean to helping businesses prepare for this. It's going to come down to, your individual appetite to address risk. But when these things happen, and they will happen, if you've prepared, then you'll be in a much better position to address it. And, that's why, I think about a client we helped just recently, through a process. They've got a full media release plan. They've got playbooks for every different type of perceived threat. And so in the midst of an emergency, and I mean, we see this in cockpits, in airplanes, right? Pilots aren't necessarily sitting there trying to diagnose everything as it's happening. They're pulling out these books of reference, which get them to go through checklists. It's systematic. And, that sort of practice, as well as skill, comes into the fore when they've got issues that come up. And I guess that same approach holds when it comes to cybersecurity, is that if you can prepare well for how you will respond, then you'll be in the best place to respond that you can be, because you may not necessarily have been able to prevent the breach, but you can certainly act quickly to stem the bleeding, and hopefully mitigate the continuance of that breach. Know then what the depth and breadth of that breach might be, what the impact it is to your business, your customers, whether or not you've lost access to systems, and then take appropriate steps under law and under obligation with your customers. But there's nothing worse than not being prepared, because then it is a case of what do we do? And it's probably the worst place a business can find itself.
Yeah. So in summary, this idea of cybersecurity, which for many of us, I guess has been in our minds, but not really at the forefront of our thinking when it comes to tapping away at apps on our phone or on the computer or whatever. This is serious stuff. We really ought to be taking it a lot more seriously, right?
Yeah, it's a real stop and think moment. It really
so
is.
be like individual business or whatever. We should all be thinking about it a lot more seriously.
Absolutely. Yeah. We can't take things for granted, and I think a lot of people do move, trustfully and willfully into arrangements, with software providers or whatever it may be, without necessarily considering that element of risk. And we see it quite regularly with businesses that get managed service providers in. They outsource their IT for support, etc. But outsourcing that mechanism does not outsource the ownership of responsibility. If something goes wrong, the regulators and your customers are looking at you. Not your IT managed service provider. And you can be sure that the agreements that they've created insulate them effectively to do so. And look at that. That's not their job necessarily, depending on what your arrangement might be. But the ownership of the risk always sits with the business. And all too often we find business leaders in a situation where they've got a false sense of security, and somehow they've outsourced that responsibility, but the responsibility doesn't move outside. You've got your data in a system. It's still your responsibility to maintain access to it, and protect that data.
Yeah. Okay. Well, lots to think about for everyone, from individuals to business owners there. Thank you, James. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us about such a interesting and serious subject.
Yeah, not at all.
But before you go, we like to talk about cars, of course. So I'm going to have to ask you two things. One, your daily driver car. What do you drive? And two, if money were no object, it was not a consideration at all, what would you be driving?
Sure. Yeah. Well, these days I'm driving around in a 2022 Nissan Patrol V8. Which,
Nice.
I probably never thought that I'd get into a V8 before they all become extinct, but
Yes.
it's a great piece of kit, great car, great family car. And we have a lot of fun in that. We do a lot of off-roading. And money no object. It's always a tough one, right? But
Isn't it?
Even though I'm such a technology focused person, I can't get past the analog driving experience. I'm still young enough to cherish the old three pedals that sit in the driver's footwell there, even though I don't have one at the moment. And I think McLaren F1 still sits as the pinnacle, I think, of automotive analog engineering at its finest. And I think, despite the price of those cars, which are excessive, they're a timepiece. And I think they're, I guess, an automotive feat. And I think that they're an amazing vehicle. If I couldn't get into one of those, I think, a Porsche GT3 manual would probably suit me quite well. I could settle for that.
Not an old classic car then, not like I don't know, an XC Cobra or anything like that.
I suppose some of the classic cars haven't always been at the top of my list. I've got great admiration for these wonderful things that have been created over time. There's lots of respect for the classic car, and some of the cars that I had as a kid or were around are starting to become classic. That sign of the time. So,
sure.
It depends how you look at it. A classic car could evolve to be, a Nissan GTR in the near future.
Sure. Yeah.
So we think back to the R32 days and Bathurst. Look, I've still got great respect for all walks of cars, but they're I'm more modern than I am. Antique.
Okay. All right. Well, look, James, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Important subject and great to get your insight. Thank you so very much.
I appreciate it. It's an important topic, and hopefully today people pick up a piece of knowledge and aren't scared by it. They just need to acknowledge and embrace it. This is just part of how we need to think these days. So I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Great. All right. Thanks, James.
So.
Cheers.